Okay, so we're going to talk about ancient plants and modern design. And this is a topic that I really love because I think that not enough people realize that you can use native plants in very contemporary and interesting and new ways. So we're going to dig into it. All right, here's the overview. First, we're going to talk about prairie formation. How did our prairies come to be, and why are the plants there so resilient? It's going to seem like it doesn't matter because it was so long ago, but understanding how the prairies will form will maybe give you a deep appreciation of the plants that live there now and how we can use them wisely. We'll talk about plant communities in the landscape and how we can build plant communities to create really beautiful landscapes that are resilient. And then design principles and best management practices. Okay, so we're going to go back. We're going to go way back. About 100 million years ago, the much of the middle of the US was covered in an ocean. So that includes Kansas and even Nebraska, Oklahoma, the Dakotas, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So this was a shallow sea, and there were all kinds of very terrifying dinosaurs like mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, giant sharks, all those sea beasts. Were living in this inland sea. And this is important to note because as we're going to talk about, as that sea drained away, it helped to create the soils and the profile, the soil profile that we have now that have created the prairies. So there's a sea. If you imagine, at the bottom of the ocean is all this sludge, all this kind of slime, right? And that is the decay of all of the ocean organisms, all of everything from, a 30-foot long dinosaur to a tiny little, almost microscopic sea plankton that is all dying and falling to the floor and decaying. And that has impacted what our soils are like today. And also, you see all of these limestone deposits and very limey, chalky soil. That was partially from this time. So as that ocean drained away, and as it kind of ebbed and flowed over millions of years, you get these really interesting rock formations. So this is Rock City, which is in Minneapolis, Kansas. If you've never been there, it's a great day trip. You can climb on the rocks and have a picnic. But they were formed on the edge of that inland sea as it was kind of rising and falling over millions of years. The water kind of made these what are called concretions, which are kind of like sedimentary rocks that get real gooey stuff in between, and they get very, very hard. And so then as the water flowed away, it took all the soft stuff and left only the round, hard centers. Now, I'm not a natural historian. I'm not a geologist. So if any of you are knowledgeable about rocks, forgive me, but this is just the Reader's Digest version. And because of that inland sea, you also have these incredible rock formations out in western Kansas. This one's in Oakley, a beautiful rock formations out there that look like they belong in Utah, but they don't. They were actually at the bottom of the ocean. If any of you have ever been diving and see these beautiful rock formations underwater, just imagine that all the water's gone and this is what you'd be left with. So all that chalky, sandy, some of those areas are because of the fact that we were an ocean long, long time ago. Okay, so let's fast forward a little bit. The Rocky Mountains, about 75 million years ago, the Rocky Mountains start to push up in the middle of the continent, okay? So the prairies aren't around yet. They're just a twinkle in the eye, okay? So we have these mountains that are just starting to push up, two plates butting together underneath the continent, pushing up these Rocky Mountains. And what is happening is that the weather is changing. So as these mountains get higher and higher, they disrupt the warm, moist air that comes off the Pacific Ocean. That warm, moist air changes temperature as it rises, as you see here in the graphic, changes temperature, it condenses and lets all its water out as it passes over the mountain. So then there's a wet side and a dry side. And what is now Kansas is on the dry side. So the sea drains away because of that uplift. It drains mostly to the east and creates some of those well-known river valleys that we know now. And now we have these mountains that are changing the climate in the middle part of the continent. And if you're wondering why wait a minute, it's not like it's wet all the way from the Rockies to the Pacific coast. There's a lot of dry areas. This happens many, many times to that warm Pacific area before it even gets to the Rockies. So it happens on the edge of the ocean range and then again in the Sierra Nevadas, and that's what creates that big dry spell in like places like Death Valley. So because we're in the rain shadow, we don't get a lot of water in some parts of the state. So when you look at the western part of the state, we're getting sometimes less than 15 inches of rain per year. I think that the designation of a desert is only about 10 inches of rain per year. So that's pretty close to being a desert. And then in the middle part of the state, where Harvey County is, where Dick Arboretum is, we're getting reliably 30 to 32, sometimes 35 inches of rain per year. Now, that's not actually that much less than a very wet place like, like Seattle. I think their average rainfall is right around 40 inches per year. But the difference is that we get ours all at once seasonally. Sometimes, we might get 10 inches in May and then it won't rain for months. And other places are getting a little bit of rain at a time, and that makes a big difference in terms of what vegetation and the climate is like. And then in eastern Kansas, as you move farther away from that rain shadow effect, you get even more and more rain. So you're getting 45, 46 inches in the farthest east part of Kansas. Okay, so let's speed up, right? We were at 100 million years ago, then 75 million years ago. Now let's talk about just about 2 million years ago. We had glaciers, and glaciers had a big impact on what the soil is like here. Glaciers covered, this is during the Ice Age, they covered a huge portion of the North American continent, and they even reached down into just the top part of Kansas. And in front of those glaciers is what we call glacial till. So they were pushing down from the north, and they were pushing with them all kinds of soil and rocks. So we often get really interesting rocks, like see in that picture, that they are not from Kansas. And for a long time, geologists were thinking, okay, what are these doing here? And studies have shown that they were probably carried here by glaciers. And the other thing that happened is all of that pushing of material out front of those glaciers created a hilly landscape. And so part of that, the hilliness in eastern Nebraska and northern Kansas can be attributed to the pushing of the glaciers and all the material that was building up in front. And when they melted, a lot of that runoff made those hills even more pronounced. And so the Flint Hills are partially hilly because of some of that glacial activity. And also during this time period, it was a very dramatic time, right? There were mammoths walking on the prairie, and mammoths were, these were vegetation eaters. They were vegetarians, and they were eating the early plants that were on the plains. There were three-toed, or I don't know, not three-toed sloth, but that's what we have now. What do you call them? Oh, giant sloths, mega sloths, that were like 10 feet tall, and they were eating trees. And in fact, I mean, that's an ancient animal, and one of the plants that they ate, we think, was the seeds of the Kentucky coffee tree. Kentucky coffee tree is something we sell at our sale. It's a native tree that you find around in low spots in Kansas, but the seed is very large, and as far as we know, there's not many animals that eat that seed and disperse the seed. So it's thought that the dispersal mechanism for that seed was actually this extinct giant sloth. So whenever you're looking at a Kentucky coffee tree, you can think, wow, giant sloths used to eat this. And there were huge volcanoes at that time. So not only did we have glaciers coming forward and receding and pushing dirt around and washing over the newly formed soil, we had these giant animals that were turning over the soil and eating plants and kind of determining what vegetation is going to grow there. We also had volcanic eruptions that were spewing ash over the central United States and contributing to the soil layer. So it was exciting times. So if you get to relatively recent, 110,000 years ago, prairies have emerged, okay? And you get what you see in front of you, which is the Great Plains region. And that lightest green is what we call the shortgrass prairie. So these are very, very dry, arid areas. And the vegetation is only going to get about a foot to a foot and a half tall in most places. We're talking like blue grama grass, little blue stem, very sparse, very low to the ground to preserve their water. Many, many beautiful flowers, but pretty short stuff. Then you're going to get the mixed grass prairie, which is that middle green. And these are areas that may have shorter stuff, but can also have plants that are anywhere from 3 to 4 to 5 feet tall. And this area gets a little bit more rain and is known for its very fertile soils. And as you can see, that really coincides with the farming belt, that mixed grass area, because it's very, very fertile after all of that activity after millions of years. And then the darkest green is the tall grass prairie. Now that's where the plants and grasses could be anywhere from 5 to even 8 feet tall at sometimes in rainy years. So very, very dense, lush prairie areas that would have been primarily managed by fire, sometimes just natural fires, but often fires that were set by the native people who were living here, not 100,000 years ago, but maybe more like 20,000 years ago. And also bison would have been grazing on these areas freely, no fences, and they would have been grazing by the millions. So that is how this ecosystem evolved. Kansas, like I said, was an ocean, it was a swamp, it was an ash-covered place for a while. It's been through many iterations, but now all of those things have led to the prairie. And this is what they would have looked like uninterrupted. So they were very treeless, very open treeless places. And all of the plants that have evolved to thrive here were very, very hardy plants. And they have all of the right adaptations for this place. They can take very hot summers, very dry winters, and they can handle being eaten off by, bison or elk and trampled on. Very, very tough plants. But unfortunately, as Europeans got here in the 1860s, what they saw was very, very fertile ground, and they weren't wrong. All of that activity had led to incredible farm ground. So if you till it up, you see this rich black dirt underneath that is excellent for farming. Unfortunately, a little too excellent. So only about 4% is left, which is a little bit concerning. Grasslands are one of the most endangered ecosystems in the world, not just North American grasslands, but all over the globe, because people look at a rainforest and they think, oh, well, we need to preserve, this biodiversity. Or they might look at the ocean and say, we really need to preserve the biodiversity. But often grasslands get overlooked. People look at grassland and they say, well, we should mow it or put a parking lot there. But grasslands have incredible biodiversity, and both above and below the soil layer. And these areas have led to some of the most prosperous farm ground, yes, and some great economic success for the farmers and for the nation. But if we're not careful, we're going to lose them and lose some of the ancient, very hardy plants that have evolved to be there. So why have these plants been so successful? If we know this, we can know how to best use them in our home landscapes where we are trying to have resilient and native landscapes. So one of the ways that they've been so successful is by evolving in drought-tolerant ways, having drought-tolerant structures in their physiology. So the drought-tolerant structures in the leaves, a lot of prairie plants, almost every prairie plant has some little special thing that it's doing. But compass plant is a great story. Compass plant gets its name because its leaves stand straight up. They stand usually vertical, and that is to avoid the straight down rays of the sun. So those really harsh downward rays in the middle of the day. If you go to the tropics, you often see plants that have leaves that are facing the sun, that are trying to soak up all the sun they can get, because they're usually competing for sun with very high canopied trees. So they're trying to maximize the sun, but not compass plant. Compass plant is trying to minimize those harsh rays so it doesn't dry out and burn. So it is straight up and down, so it gets the east sun and the west sun, but avoids some of that harsh, straight angled rays. And it's fanned out, like it has fingers, and that can help with some airflow, keeping it a little bit cooler. If you put your fingers together, my coworker Brad Gore always does this with kids, having them put their fingers together in the summer and see whether their hand gets hot versus spreading their hand out. So that's really fascinating. And lastly, it has hairs on the stem. And I can imagine if I didn't have hair on my head would get sunburned and it'd be very hot. The same thing for compass plant. The hairs kind of reflect some light. They're white and they're very, what's the word, wiry. And so they can serve as like a little bit of reflectant, and also they make it not very fun to eat. So if I'm a bison coming along, it wouldn't be my first choice because it's kind of hairy and prickly. So secondly, they have deep and efficient root systems. And we talk a lot about deep root systems of prairie plants. Some recent studies show that maybe we don't understand how they work quite yet. So we know, I think my next slide shows, yeah, this is a good example. So we know from studying prairie plants that their root systems are incredibly deep, sometimes beyond 10 feet, 10 to 12 to 13 feet deep into the soil. And we used to think that that was so that they could get water that was locked down deep in the soil. But recently, studies have shown that they're not really pulling moisture from that deep in the ground. So what are those roots doing down there? Well, we don't quite know what they're doing down there. There's a great blog post by Chris Helzer on the Prairie Ecologist, which is where this graphic is from, that talks a little bit about those studies, about how it's kind of a myth to say that the roots are deep and they're pulling moisture from that deep. What we do know is that grasses, even if they have very, very deep root systems, are usually only pulling moisture from the first 30 inches. So they have very dense fibrous root systems that are pulling moisture from the top layer of soil. And then we know that forbs, or wildflowers, are pulling it from just below the grass layer, probably so they don't have to compete with grasses, because you can't. They're very vigorous, their root systems are very dense. So it may be that the flowers are reaching just under that really dense layer to try to pull the moisture that the grasses aren't getting to. And then shrubs, surprising to me, had the deepest root systems, and they were actually pulling moisture from 8 or 10 feet down. And that, I think, is why you see in some prairies that haven't been burned frequently, you see shrubs really taking over because they have an advantage. They are pulling moisture from very, very deep and continuing to grow even in times when there's not a lot of moisture to be pulled up top. So we're not quite sure why the roots are so deep, but they must be working quite efficiently. The plant, the thought is that the plant's not pulling water from down deep. It's just learning how to survive with very, very little water. So prairie plants, regardless of how they're doing it, can do it really well. And they don't need a lot of water because they have evolved in these very harsh climates. So those deep and efficient root systems have helped immensely. The other way to be successful is to procreate. If you're a plant, you are trying to make seeds so you can make more of yourself. And so coevolution with the creatures that are living around you is a great way to do that. So these are not prairie species, but they're just really obvious examples that are nice to look at. So for one option is to look at this bird with a very curved beak. As the flower is evolving larger and larger, so is the bird's beak. So over many, many, many generations, the birds that had slightly longer beaks were able to drink the nectar, and therefore they were more likely to live long enough to produce offspring. Those offspring were likely to inherit the gene that caused a long beak. And so you see how as the flower got longer, the beaks got longer, and back and forth. So the flower benefited because it's possible that the longer the tube, the more pollination is happening, and the bird is benefiting because it is probably one of the only birds in its area that can feed on that flower, so it's not competing with other birds. The same thing happens with like moths. Some moth tongues are so incredibly long because the pollen tubes on the orchids that they pollinate are incredibly long, and that happens over thousands and thousands of years of coevolution. So while these aren't examples that happen in the prairie, this is happening in every ecosystem. On the prairie, we have bees and butterflies that have a certain length of tongue that can reach into our regional flowers. And when you go down to the nursery or your Lowe's or your Home Depot, and you buy a non-native annual flower, sometimes that's fine, but a lot of times our bees can visit that flower, but they can't drink because their tongue is not long enough. It's usually a tropical flower that's native to Africa or South America, and they can't quite reach the nectar or the pollen. So it's something to keep in mind that when you're planting native, not only are you getting plants that are well adapted to this area, but you are serving the animals that are adapted to those plants. Lastly, living in community. So the success of a person we know is rarely just them. It's usually them in community with people who are helping them. And that is so true for plants. Plants do not live just one out on its own. That's pretty rare, especially in the prairie. In the prairie, plants are living very close together, all bunched together, and there's a reason. And that is that there are tall plants, and you see in that top layer, there are tall plants that are shading the lower layers. And those lower layers, maybe the bottom layer, those plants couldn't take the harsh direct sun. So they benefit from being in the shade of taller species. But the taller species benefit because that ground cover layer is covering the soil, preventing the evaporation of moisture and preventing the sun from beating down on it. So it's this give and take. And when you plant things that aren't geographically related, when you're not thinking about what plants work well together, you often get something that takes a lot of maintenance to maintain and never seems to thrive. I'll also note that prairies kind of make their own fertilizer. Nobody was coming along and dumping chemicals on the prairie to keep it blooming. Of course, bison were out there fertilizing in their own way, but when you think of all of the legume species like Baptisia, Illinois bundleflower, partridge pea, these are species that create nitrogen in the soil by fixing it from the air. And grass actually takes a lot of nitrogen. So the grass that's growing right next to it, or sometimes right on top of it, is pulling that nitrogen out. So when you're planting things that are used to living in community, you start to get all of these great interactions that if you don't plant native, or you're kind of just pulling like from random plants from here and there just based on aesthetics, you're kind of missing out on some of that free help that you would be getting in your garden. So this is a good example of kind of traditional landscaping that looks nice, but it's a good example of what not to do if you want to plant in community. So you've got these plants that are all spaced out. There's all this space in between that this person has to weed, right? Because all that empty space is going to be full of weeds if you don't stay on it. And then they're all evergreen. So you're not getting any like seasonal blooms. It's not really providing any nectar. And the plants aren't going to be like, they're not shading each other out, maybe when they're taller, but a lot of these are the type that don't get very big. So even when they're full grown, they're not like going to be shading each other or helping each other in ways. And I don't see any like pea species, so not a lot of nitrogen fixation. And these are not geographically related in any way. So very little community here. It looks nice and it's classic traditional landscaping, but I kind of hate it. So there's another way to think about it. So we've been talking about plant communities, and really the definition of that is just a collection of species who are related geographically. And that might look like a desert, right? A naturally occurring plant community looks like cactus, sagebrush, prickly pear, maybe some real short scrubby grasses, some of those types of things. They would be growing out if you were hiking in the desert. But you can reimagine those spaces as well. You can reimagine them into areas that are really interesting and clearly human made, but that serve an aesthetic function, but still retain the plant community. So you're not putting a tropical plant right next to a cactus, right next to a temperate, spruce tree. That just takes a lot of extra maintenance and doesn't really look right. This looks so nice, and it's probably by somebody's pool maybe, or in their backyard, because it's all the plants fit together geographically, and they take the same kind of maintenance too. So as we move on to design principles, thinking about plant communities and the formation of the prairies and how to put that into a usable design for our home gardens or our landscapes in in city spaces. We can try to balance ecological function and aesthetics. So this is a great quote that I use in every presentation. So I'm sure if you've watched a presentation from me, you've heard this quote 1,000 times, but I'll never stop because it's so good. What is good for the ecosystem often looks disorderly, but what is neat and tidy is unsustainable. And we see that in declining bird populations, declining insect populations, just declining ecosystem health in many of our urban areas and beyond. Because, this picture of a prairie is beautiful, but it's only beautiful on a grand scale. It doesn't actually work well aesthetically or otherwise in, say, a small lawn plot, or in your backyard. It can be kind of hard to maintain. Often cities have ordinances against it. Oop, my dog is in the room. Often cities have ordinances against this kind of foliage in the yard. But when you look at the other side, that type of lawn that is cut so short, that has little trimmed bushes that are non-native, that has small trees that are non-native, it's not providing any nectar. It takes a lot of chemicals and water to upkeep. So we always try to find the middle ground between those two worlds. And there's a wonderful middle ground where you can use native plants, but in a garden setting. And I want to emphasize that a prairie garden is not a prairie. A prairie has, like you see in this picture, a prairie has no particular pattern. It's just as the seeds scatter. It's random. It's chaos. A prairie garden is not that way. A prairie garden should use native species, but in a way that is patterned and that has clear design principles and that has a human intention. So we'll talk more about that. So here's an example of probably a very ecosystem friendly landscape, right? This maybe is in somebody's pasture, or it could be in somebody's backyard, and it has a little path through it. I don't find it particularly attractive as a landscape because it's missing organization, it's missing color blocking, it's missing repetition. But it's probably great for the birds and the animals living there. So we need to take that benefit and turn it into something that is more of a garden space. And I would do something like this. Still have a path through it, still use similar species. Like in here, we have Amsonia, we have Columbine, we might have some prairie salvia. You can use some prairie species, but create a space that is very clearly cared for, because you can see the repetition of color, you can see clear edges, and that it's very, the human design element is obvious. And that's something that, as you start to look around and see landscapes, you can tell that the landscapes that people tend to like the most are ones that have very clean edges. So that's what we're going to talk about, is framing. There's this great study by Joan Nassauer. I think she's like upper Midwest, like Michigan or Minnesota University. She did a study about how people don't like natural areas. They don't like natural areas in the city, especially. We all want to go on vacation to a national park, but we definitely don't want any unmowed lawns in the city next to us. So she was kind of working with, like, what is it with people that they don't like? And this is a quote from her study that ecologically valuable landscapes, those landscapes that are diverse, that have lots of birds and insects and tall grasses, they're not well liked if the human intention isn't clear. So that's where very clean lines come in. So this picture, you have all of these lush plants and very tall, thick grasses, but they have a sidewalk through them, a very straight edge. So it's very clear, if you're visiting this garden or walking by, where you're supposed to be and where the wildness kind of ends and where the safe space for you to walk is. It also visually is so nice to have edges, and that can be created with rock edging, that might be metal or aluminum edging, could be a driveway or between sidewalks, between curbs. Anything you can do to distinguish the space that you're going to design your prairie garden in is going to help immensely, not only for you for your design purposes, but for anybody who's viewing, driving by, walking by, if you're in an urban landscape, as much as I'd like to say, I don't care what anyone thinks, we kind of have to because we live in society. And if we want these landscapes to be valued, and if you want somebody to come and say, wow, so ecologically friendly and water wise, I want to do that too, it has to be clear that it's a garden and not just a wild space. So here's a great example of somebody doing it just with mowing. Mowing a clean edge along a very, very lush prairie meadow planting is all it takes to make this very inviting. And it's very clear where the prairie stops and the manicured yard begins. And that means that if you were to have a backyard barbecue, people would know exactly where they were supposed to stand and not stand, and where it's probably safe to not get chiggers and where you're going to get chiggers. That kind of thing really helps people interpret what they're seeing garden-wise. So this one is an example of maybe needs some organization. So I see a lot of folks who say, well, I want lush prairie plants and I want to do something great for the birds. And this yard is probably doing that. There are wonderful species in here. I think I see maybe velvety gora in the back and blanket flower in the front. There's some bachelor buttons, which aren't native, but are always fun. Cactus. I mean, this is a great garden in terms of species diversity, but I think it lacks organization. I don't know where I'm supposed to walk. I'm not sure how to get to is this front door, back door? I don't know. I found this on Google, so I hope this is nobody's house, but I think it needs some design. It needs repetition. It needs some edges. It needs something to take it from kind of a prairie, small prairie, to a prairie garden. So one thing you could do is to design with color, to take those plants, right? And these are prairie plants that have been surviving here for thousands of years. You can put them into any design you want. And we'll talk more later about the different types of design. But one basic principle is to just start with color. If you don't know anything else, just start with color and think about if you want a lot of diversity, which is great for ecosystem function, you want to go with less color because it's always going to look more put together and more planned. So if this were my garden and I already had this, which looks like a very Mediterranean garden, not all of this is native. The photo is just instructive. There's some like gray Santolina, there's some lavender, and there's some coreopsis. If this is what I had going and I wanted to add to it, I could add an iris. I wouldn't want a swamp iris, but there are some drought tolerant iris that would work well in here that are purple and yellow. So I'm working within the same color scheme. I could add blue-eyed grass. That is going to be pretty drought tolerant, like some of these other species, and it blooms in spring. And these often don't bloom until later in the summer. So that would be a nice little pop of color that doesn't make it look too busy. And primrose. Primrose is an all-around great plant, especially if your color palette includes yellow or its opposite, which is like in the purple blue. It always makes a big splash, blooms in the spring, has really cool seed pods and color in the fall, and it's a great early season nectar source for any insects that wake up that early in the year. So that would be a way to add, if you're looking to add to your landscape and you want to design something extra, but you don't want to make it look busy, try to stick in the same color themes. So this is a good example that I found online. Very, very dense. I'm sure there are lots of happy insects and birds who are visiting this garden. But notice it's super dense and super thick, and there's certainly no place for bindweed to come up in there because every spot is full and there's no sun getting to the soil. So dense is good. But there's a mown edge right next to it, which makes it look very tidy, very orderly. And the color palette is pretty simple. You have reds and oranges with pops of purple and white. So you have the accent of the whitish grass and an accent of purple, just a little bit, but the rest of it is in that red, orange, yellow family. That is what's really working here. Also, the repetition of those tall grasses in the back, that repetition kind of draws the eye across the landscape and makes it seem like it's all one carefully planned thing, even if, I don't know, this person might have decided the last minute to throw those, looks like maybe calendula or marigolds in the front. it's looking all put together because it has a structural layer that is repetitive. This is another good example of using repetition. Very small backyard, an incredible amount of plant diversity in a tiny space. But it would be so nice to walk out there in the morning with, my cup of tea because the sidewalk is very clearly maintained and the repetition of the plants makes it clear that this is not random. This is not, a backyard that's just been let go. This is carefully planned because you have these repeating, I think that's Carl Forester grass with maybe some tall coreopsis in the yellows. You have repeating bronze grasses and yellow flowers over and over and over again with just some pops of purple and red. Again, a pretty limited color palette. You don't have, all of these other colors all mixing together to make it too busy for the eye. You can also design with geography. So mixing plants into an existing garden or, thinking about, I'm not a purist, so there are lots of plants that are not native that I really like and I like to include in my garden, but they have to check a few boxes. Are they invasive? If they're invasive, they have no place in your garden or mine, and people shouldn't be selling them. And two, are they water wise? If they take a lot of water and resources, I'm just not interested. It's not worth my time and it's a waste because there are so many good natives to choose from. But there are some things that check my boxes in a good way and they deserve a spot in the garden because, it's fun to experiment. But oftentimes things don't look quite right. So you can design with geography and think about where that plant might be native to, do some research before you buy and say, okay, if it's native to a climate that is similar to mine, it's probably going to look right. And if it's not, it won't. And here's a good example. If you were to mix this plant into that landscape behind, that landscape is full of coneflower and grasses and yarrow. If you were to mix this plant in, it wouldn't look right, right? Even if you could get it to grow there, something about it does not mix with these plants. And that's because it's from the tropics. That's I think a heliconia. It grows in very wet areas that, tropical, very close to the equator, totally different physiology, evolved in a totally different place. And that's why the leaf is a little bit too green, the flower shape is not quite right to blend in, and it's way too glossy. But if you take that away and you were to mix in something like this, it would look fine, right? That's Russian sage, and Russian sage is from a very dry, rocky place. It's from kind of an inhospitable area in the Eurasian steppes. And that's why it tends to do really well in Kansas, and it looks fine when you mix it with our native prairie plants because the physiology is the same. Even though they didn't develop in the same place, they developed under the same conditions, similar conditions. So that's why Russian sage does so well here and tends to look really good in prairie landscapes. So like I said, I always prefer to use natives, but that's not for everybody. And sometimes you have a favorite plant, or you have a plant that you dug up at grandma's house that you really want to incorporate. And if you want to think about critically about how to design with it, do some research about where it was from, and then try to put it in a similar with similar plants from a location that's like that. So here's a little design example, and I showed this when I went to a talk in Western Kansas. This is an example of a regional plant community design. So I was going to Western Kansas, so I drew up a design of Western Kansas specific species. These are things that will thrive with very little water, that are going to stay pretty short, and that are all geographically related, that would have been native growing together for thousands of years. So they should like growing together in a landscape. They're also all going to take the same kind of maintenance because they grow together wild, so they get the same type of maintenance out there, and that is they've been grazed, they've been burned. So that means we can mow them off all at the same time and they should be fine. So that's kind of the benefit of planting in community. But anyways, this is a great little landscape that features little blue stem in the back, blue grama grass in the middle for texture, and then lots of liatris as kind of a vertical element. You always want some round shapes and some vertical shapes. And then primrose as a pop of color, and that pop of color is opposite on the color wheel. So there's yellow and there's purple. So you want to stay opposite on the color wheel when you're looking for contrast. And if I think I can fill it in here. Oh yeah, and fame flower in the front. And fame flower is also known as Telinum. It's a purple flower, and this is one of my favorite little plants because it'll grow in a crack in your driveway. It'll grow just in rocks in nothing. And it blooms almost all summer, and it's only about a foot tall, and I never water it at my house or at the Arboretum, and it looks so good. It's a great little plant if you have a very dry area. I put mine right by the street. It gets very hot there, and it loves it, and people always stop and ask me about it. And because it's so short and it's in the front, you can put it with that primrose. Should look really nice and short and manageable. And then with the Blonde Ambition in the back, kind of creating some texture and some airiness, some flowy. Oh yeah, and a little bit of Western coneflower. I think this is Angustifolia. Yeah, so a little bit of coneflower, a short coneflower that can provide the round. So we have the fame flower is kind of a star shape. The primrose is round, but it's almost fluted. It's a little bit like a cup tan. And so it's nice to have a round radial flower because when you're looking at it all, you want some of those contrasting shapes as the seasons go. Little blue stem as kind of the backbone that you're going to look at all these plants against to create a little bit of a backdrop is what I'm trying to say. A backdrop so that when you look at the flowers, you can really see their colors. And then some Liatris punctata, which is the Western Kansas species, shorter, very, very drought tolerant, incredible plant in terms of pollinator activity. They are always just covered. So this is an example of, I just took very few species. What is that? 6 species, and just repeat. Choose a few species, especially if you can choose them like this regionally and say, these are all things that have grown together, that have evolved together, so they should be fine in my garden together. And I highly suggest repeat, repeat, repeat. You're going to want to design with like lots of species because plants are so fun and you want to get one of everything. But in terms of a really attractive garden that is easy to maintain in the future, repetition is your friend. Because you will forget all of those interesting plants you bought and then you'll lose the tags and you won't know what to weed. But if you repeat them many, many times, it'll be obvious. So these native plants, if you're not just going to do just a freestyle design like that, you can work into a garden motif or a garden style that has been around a long time, but using natives. So this is like a formal French garden. And this would be what you would see if you go to Europe and you visit these beautiful castles. Formal French style came around about the 16th century. And this was happening in England too. Societies that had aristocracy at this time, these aristocrats, they had these huge chateaus and big estates. And these estates were being maintained by staff. And somewhere along the line, around the 16th century, people started creating these geometric gardens. And then it became a competition about which castle had the greatest geometric garden. And they'd fight over gardeners and they'd bring in these landscape architects of the time to design these awe-inspiring gardens. Now, those gardens were maintained by highly skilled people who had nothing else to do. That's not our situation anymore. Ironically, that formal French style of tidy trimmed bushes and geometric patterns and symmetry, that has persisted today in a lot of the horticultural practices that are still in use. If you buy a new house and you get a landscaper to come in, a lot of the things that were prevalent in formal French gardens end up in modern landscaping, which is really dumb because not only do we not have the right climate for that, it's a lot of maintenance to try to keep your bushes constantly trimmed and to keep the ground constantly bare in those areas. It's too much. So if you wanted to do this style because you like the look, but you wanted to do it with natives that were a little bit lower maintenance, you can do that. So instead of boxwood, which I don't really like because I think it smells like cat pee. It tends to get fungus and it takes a little bit of water if you want it to look nice. There are a lot of people who love boxwood. Don't come for me. I just don't like it. If you want a native plant that can maybe serve that purpose and made into a little hedge, you might think of aronia. There's a little type of aronia called ground hug. It is really cute, stays only about 1.5 feet tall. If you want to train it into a hedge, you'll have to trim the sides, but it will never get taller than 1.5 feet. So that's even less maintenance than a boxwood, I think. Or you could do it with a low growth sumac. You could train it into a little hedge if you had all the time in the world. But they would be very drought tolerant and they would grow well. Inside the shrubs, if you wanted to do this, these beautiful geometric formal garden patterns, you could use low growing natives like a snow flurry, white heath aster, or alliums as onions, or even like blue grama grass that's short and wispy and would contrast nicely with all those sharp edges. So yeah, native plants in any style, formal French is possible. I love it. I don't have the space for it, but I think it'd be very fun to experiment with. Maybe I can do one at the Arboretum. So another popular style that's really coming in right now is the contemporary garden. Um, this kind of started in the like mid-century vibe, and the hallmarks of this one, rather than geometric patterns and repeated symmetry, this is all about clean lines and irregularity. So, not symmetrical, kind of strange, abstract movements in the visual line, but very clean, straight lines, no curves, not in contemporary, not in this example at least, and known for its really clean simplicity is kind of the key. So if you love the contemporary look, that's great. I think prairie plants lend themselves really well to this style. You just have to choose the right ones. So if you wanted to do this landscape, just replace these little non-native grasses. Of course, I don't know where this is from. Maybe they're native to that area. But if you wanted to do it in Kansas, I would replace these grasses, the short ones, with prairie dropseed. I'd replace those taller ones, those focal points, with little blue stem or maybe even a short switchgrass. And then as an accent, like purple prairie clover or purple poppy mallow, some little pop of color that stays low to the ground. And then you'd have it. You'd have this very contemporary design, but with plants that make sense for this region. I cannot tell you how often people will pay for a landscape design from, licensed landscapers who probably don't live in our state. Some people do like landscaping from afar, and they will come up with these beautiful designs, but the plant material is all wrong. So just double and triple check that the plant material that you're looking at, that you saw online and you loved, double check and make sure that it actually is going to do well here, because you have plants at your disposal that have been living here for thousands and thousands of years. Ancient plants, right? That will do great even in your modern contemporary landscape. And this is what I would consider traditional suburban. So if you were to go buy a new house right now that just had landscaping put in, oftentimes it looks like this, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. This is a beautiful home. I hate it. I dislike that there's all these evergreens. If this were in Kansas, that is. I dislike using evergreens because most of these are going to be susceptible to bagworms. And everybody who says, oh, this never gets bagworms, I don't believe them. Every evergreen gets bagworms, except Arizona cypress. Those tend not to get bagworms and actually do pretty well in Kansas. But the only native evergreen is an eastern red cedar, and it comes with its own set of problems. So the first thing I would do is maybe not do these focal point evergreens, and I would add a crabapple tree. A crabapple tree provides way better spring color than a dumb old evergreen. It provides fall color as well. It provides pollen for bees in the spring. The crabapples here at the Arboretum are buzzing with bees every spring. And it has a berry for birds. It's the dream. It's the dream tree. And then I would do away with all these tiny little shrubs that are like spaced way apart and have no community and probably are going to take a lot of water to keep alive. And I would put in native shrubs. That's a native lead plant. Lead plant, especially right next to the driveway, all that concrete, it's going to get very hot. Lead plant is great in the hot, hot sun. It is a beautiful native shrub, one of the few true native prairie shrubs that is used to growing on the open prairie. And it blooms in June. So by the time that crabapple is done blooming, that lead plant is going to be lighting up and giving its own color. So you kind of want to time that bloom. And a lot of this landscaping is just kind of, it has a pop in summer and then it fizzles out to nothing. And then I would add some grass. So a little bit of grass provides beautiful texture and color. So by the time that the lead plant is done and it's not looking like much in the fall, here comes the switchgrass with its red fall color. And the same thing with the crabapple. And you're providing habitat. So you have pollen and or nectar and fruit from the crabapple. You have great pollinator activity on the lead plant too. And then you have habitat in the grass. So not only is it ecologically friendly, but I think it looks better for our area and it looks like more at home in Kansas than some of these really sparse non-native landscapes that are popular in landscaping today. And this slide is just talking about keeping it short and sweet. As you're thinking about designing with native plants and trying to work them into your kind of modern aesthetic, keep it short. If you don't know anything else and you forget everything else from the program, choose short species when you're unsure what you're going to do. Short species always come off better to an outside viewer. It always looks tidier if it's short, and it's less likely to be floppy or gangly if it's just a short species. So look for things that are kind of at that 24 inches and below, especially if you're working around a sidewalk or a driveway. If you're working up against the back of a fence, you can go tall, or if it's the back of the proposed garden bed, tall is fine. But you have to think about the golden rule of the plant shouldn't be taller than half the width of your bed. So if your garden bed is 4 feet wide, maybe say a strip along the driveway, you don't want anything over 2 feet because it will look like it's outsized for the space that it's in. So yes, keep it short and sweet. And this is a great, I think, a little native bed that people are using. Looks like maybe June grass, yarrow, some type of primrose, maybe that silver leaf, but and maybe prairie dropseed. Really only 5 or 6 species here, repeated over and over again, which kind of mimics the repeating shapes of the stones. So that repetition is very pleasing to the eye and always looks tidy. So it's very modern, but it's using native plants. So you have all these design ideas or design overwhelm, but there are things that you can do to kind of just take it piece by piece. The first thing you can do is check out our blogs. We have tons of blog material. I mean, every week we come out with something, but a lot of them are aimed at design specifically. And there are some that help you prep and design, and some that talk about design principles, and others that talk about, how to pick plant selection. So look at our blogs. They're all free on the website, dickarboretum.org. We also have classes, of course, like the one you're in now. And then there are some that are recorded that you can go back and watch. And I'm not sure how you get to those. I think you email and then we give you access. So we have classes recorded that you can enjoy. And newsletters. A lot of our newsletters come with a free landscape design that you could then take and edit, edit the plants that you want, but at least it'd be a place to start so that if you are kind of nervous about how to start designing, especially, putting it into your own style, you have a place to start and you can then maybe cut and paste or scan it in the computer and work with it from there. I like to design by hand to hand draw because I think it always goes a little better for me, but there are some great programs out there that are free that let you kind of drag and drop plants into a design, and that might be a lot of fun for people who are working with especially contemporary design. And then you can also schedule a consultation. So we do consultations. We will come to your house and look at the site, look at the soil, the sun exposure, kind of decide what will work. And then you'll tell us your concerns and your needs about, you want to change your front yard to native, or you want to have something for birds, you want to plant a pollinator garden, you want to fill this ditch that's always wet with a rain garden. You tell us those things and we can draw something up for you. The consultation itself is usually $75 plus mileage, and then the design services are after that. So if you are interested in that, just shoot us an email. We don't have a formal process just yet about how to take requests, And we only take so many per season, but you will probably either get me or Scott, and depending on your land, like what kind of project you're doing, you may also get Brad. But we come out and do those consultations, and we love it because it's a great way to help people start these big, wonderful native plant projects, and then we kind of see you develop it over the years, and you can come to our sale and get that plant material. And it's really good to make those connections because a couple years from now, people come back and they have pictures of the design that we drew, and it's all grown up now. So if you're interested in that, shoot us an email at arboretum@hesston.edu and ask for consultation services, and we can be in touch then. Okay, best management practices. We're almost done. I haven't been watching the time, so I'm not sure, but best management practices. You got to beat the weeds. So in any good design, you need to be thinking carefully about how you're going to maintain it, because the best design in the world that has no maintenance plan will not last. If you cannot maintain it, it's going to turn into chaos because plants tend towards chaos. It's the human hand that wants everything to be orderly and designed and patterned. And if that's what we're going for in our gardens, it's going to take some work. So think about mulch. Mulch is your best friend. And a lot of people don't like mulch, but I think wood chips are great if you have them. I think buying wood chips is an absolute racket. There are usually free wood chips. Like I know several cities that have a free wood chip pile. And those free wood chips are just as good as the ones you buy in the store, except they don't come wrapped in plastic and they're not dyed with a bunch of chemicals. So look or make friends with a tree trimmer in your area and get wood chips from them. Any wood chips will do. They do not have to be fancy. Leaf mulch, I think is great. I tend to use a lot of leaf mulch in my garden because I have it available and I like that it breaks down faster because I'm constantly planting and I don't want to plant around wood chips because they get splinters in my fingers. Cardboard, I put under a lot of wood chips, especially here at the Arboretum where we have some big open spaces. I put cardboard down and then I put 2 inches of wood chips on top. And that really stops a lot of weeds for about 4 to 6 months because it's stopping the sunlight from hitting the soil. So no matter what design you're doing, from formal French garden to ultra modern spaceship, whatever, you've got to think about weeds and weed management because it's so debilitating when you feel like you put all this time and money into planting and it gets overrun with bindweed. Thinking about the weeds and proper site prepping the site carefully before you start. And then maintenance, like I said, have a maintenance plan. If you are planting in community, you can take care of those plants pretty much all the same way. And what I mean by that is if you have prairie asters and prairie grasses and prairie flowers, right, you can take a hedge trimmer, cut them all down at the ground, call it good. Or burn them if you have the space and you're in the country and you can burn them. You know, they can handle the same type of care because they are used to the same conditions. If you plant a tropical species right next to a European species, right next to a prairie species, you're going to have to treat them all separately. One of them can only be trimmed and you can't cut it to the ground, and the next one really needs to be covered in winter, and the third one probably wants to be burned. That is so much work. So really think about lessening your work by not mixing in species in your garden that need special treatment. And if you love that species, put it on the edge. There are a couple bushes that I really love, but I put them on the edge of my garden so that they don't get damaged when I come in with my mower and mow it down for the spring. Secondly, think about those layers that we talked about in the beginning of the program, about those ground cover layers and those tall structural layers. So planting, thick grasses or creeping strawberries or some type of ground cover layer that is aggressive enough to cover the ground so that it competes with weeds, but not so aggressive it kills your structural species. Think sedges, really short grasses like blue grama, those types of things. And like I said, creeping strawberries or even ragwort, depending on whether you have sun or shade, those are great species to create a ground cover layer that will help with maintenance. And then of course, planting thick. This picture is to show you what not to do. It looks so nice, and this is what most people do. But if you do this, you will probably just be weeding around it forever. You will always be weeding those empty spaces, unless you put cardboard underneath and you're committed to always, renewing that mulch on top. But I like to pack things a little bit closer because then if there's a weed, one, I don't see it, and two, it probably doesn't get big enough to mature and spread seed because the sun doesn't get to it. So this is the Lurie Gardens in Chicago, and it's just a reminder that there are these super modern places, these cities that are in some ways devoid of nature. We have kind of pushed nature aside and plopped a city down and created these very artificial environments. And I think it's important to remember that we can insert nature back into urban, suburban environments in really beautiful ways. This is a garden designed by, I think, Roy Diblick, and I met him at a conference once, and he's very cool. And as they say, I fangirled very hard because he designed this, and I think he also did the Chicago Aquarium. But he's using all the principles we've talked about. Repetition. It's very wild and very lush, but if you notice, the color palette is limited. It is whites and purples, pretty much. There's a few yellows mixed in, but this time of year it was planned to have a limited color palette. There are paths in there that you just can't see from here, clear walkways, and there is a clear frame around the edge of a very carefully shaped hedge. And that goes back to that French formal style that helped to contain maybe a messy interior and made it look tidy because of that clean frame, that clean edge. So I hope this inspires you that no matter where you live, if you live in a city, if you live in a suburban environment, if you live in a neighborhood that's like all the houses have the perfect lawn that is just kind of fescue and devoid of real nature, you can insert wild, beautiful spaces in contemporary ways. And I end on this slide with our mission statement of cultivating transformative relationships between people and the land. It's been super fun recording this, and I'm excited to answer questions tonight. And I hope that this spring that you get out there and you cultivate your own relationships with the land as you garden and see the bees waking up and hear the birds singing for spring, and that you're doing something good for the planet around you. Thank you.